start.
All right, Colonel Giles.
Colonel F.S. Giles.
Colonel Giles of the
101.
101 Ranch is our interviewee today. We're very glad to hear from him. Colonel Giles, tell us something of your birthplace and your parents and how you came west.
Do I have to hold on?
No.
Well, I was born in Metuchen, New Jersey in 1894. My mother's name was Fanny and my father's name was Charles. And he was working for the New York Edison Company and decided to go west after he read the story about the 101 Ranch in the National Geographic magazine. And the spring of 1907, we left New York City and came to Bliss, Oklahoma, which is now Marlin. For a short time, Mother run a restaurant in Marlin, and Dad repaired shoes. It was a hobby of his. He made the first pair of boots and the only pair that I ever wore. A little later on, I wandered down and got a job down on the 101 Ranch and stayed there about 2 years. The famous 101 Ranch had 110,000 acres of rolling prairies. There were 3 Miller boys.
110,000.
Colonel Joe Miller, Colonel Zach Miller, and Colonel George Miller. They run and managed the ranch. Each one had his special job. Joe Miller was kind of a bookkeeper and inside man. Zach Miller was kind of a showman more than anything else, and Joe Miller was in charge of the cowboys. Some of the great cowboys and famous cowboys that worked at the 101 Ranch with me was Tom Nix, who later went into the movies. Tom was quite a fella. He was a marshal of several different places in several different states in the western part of Oklahoma. He was a rough and tumble guy, and a man that you wouldn't want to fool with. He'd fight you with his fists or with a gun. It didn't make any difference to Tom. Will Rogers was around there, in and out quite a bit, worked a little bit. Will Rogers was known to us as the old cowboys as saddle tramp. He didn't stay any place very long at any one time. He'd work a few months and then he'd travel to another ranch. He liked to move around. Charles Milam was my best friend and was a 6-foot Texas cowboy who told me and taught me what little bit I knew of cowboying. Milt Hinkle was another great cowboy that worked down there, is still alive and lives in Kissimmee, Florida. He does a lot of writing for Western magazines. I used to fix fences, do odd jobs around the place. I had about 30 or 40 horses to take care of. We'd take a bunch down to pasture and then bring another bunch of them back. We had to look after them and take care of them. There was the time that I rode with the famous Buffalo Bill, William F. Cody. He came down to the ranch looking for Joe Miller, and he was out on a roundup about 10 miles from the ranch. Zach Miller came out of the house and says, "I'm too busy." Charles Miller and I had just come in with a bunch of horses, and Zach Miller was a horse dealer. He says, "I don't have time right now to go." He says, "You saddle up 2 horses, one for Colonel and one for yourself, and take him down to the big pasture where Joe Miller is." And I did. We rode down there, and when he got through with his business, we rode back to the ranch. That was a great and very famous ride for me as a young kid to ride with Buffalo Bill. Ida Red was one of the great cowboys that worked at the 101 Ranch, and I wasn't in the bar because I don't take a drink. But this story was told to me by many of the boys when they come back to the ranch. He got in a squabble or a fight with a man in the bar, and the marshal stepped in and says, let's lay our guns on the bar and go outside and settle it. Ida Red laid his gun on the bar, and so did the marshal. Going out the door, and Zach Miller watched the marshal because he didn't like him very well, and he hollered at Ida Red. He says, Ida, he's got a Derringer. That's one of those little small guns. So Zach Miller threw his gun about 35 feet to Ida Red, and he caught it and turned around and shot the marshal. He thought he'd killed him, but he just shot him in the arm. But he was scared, and he left and went down to Texas to the first port that he could take a boat and went to Africa. They heard from him several years later.
What place was this? Do you remember which town was nearest it at that bar? Where did that
bar
take
was in Ponca City.
Ponca City.
Yeah.
All right. Now we got it located.
Ponca City.
The 101 ranch stretched over so many acres.
Oh, yes, all over the country, you know. They had line camps, you know, here, there, and yonder, where they had to cook and somebody for them to stay in. The famous Bill Pickett, who started bulldogging, was at the ranch and worked there when I was there. Dad made Bill Pickett a pair of boots. My dad had a shoe shop in Ponca City. My gear that I wore was very poor. The only thing I had that was worth anything was a nice pair of boots my dad had made for me. I had a pair of spurs, but one of the rows was broke and just shaped. Some old cowboy gave them to me because he didn't want them any longer. I had a bridle that the side leather strap on the side of the saddle was broke, and I took it up to my dad's shoe shop and had him mend it for me. The saddle I bought for $3. The equipment that I had and what I rode with was very poor. I was just a kid. Later on and down at the ranch, I met Pawnee Bill. Pawnee Bill was a great scout and school teacher and an interpreter for the Indians. He had several kind of odd jobs in the West years ago. Pawnee Bill was a mighty fine man, and I just loved him.
Was that the Pawnee Bill that later became the great circus owner?
Yeah, had a great show.
Yes.
Yeah, and he's home, you know, down there at Pawnee, up on the hill. Mm-hmm. That's the man. Mm-hmm. The great Pistol Pete. I didn't meet him until rather late, but I met him at a gun show in Tulsa, Oklahoma several years ago, but we got very friendly. I have pictures of all of these people that I mentioned. I have several of them of Pistol Pete. Pistol Pete was a great U.S. Marshal that worked in Indian Territory through and with Judge Parker, who was in Fort Smith.
Was that the hanging judge?
That's the hanging judge. Oh. Geronimo, Chief of the Apaches, was down at the 101 Ranch, and I met and talked to him several times. I have a nice picture of him. I knew Chief White Eagle of the Pawnee Indians, who came down here in 1877 from up north to the Ponca Reservation.
Yeah.
He was a mighty fine fellow, and I used to stop him on the streets in Ponca and talk to him and his little son. I wrote a poem about White Eagle, but didn't bring it along with me.
Oh, that was the son's name, White Eagle.
Huh?
White Eagle was the son.
No, White Eagle was the old man.
Oh,
yeah.
It was.
Yeah, the one that come from up north. I knew Chief Bacon Rind very well, the chief of the Osages.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, he was a little younger than some of the others. I knew Annie Oakley, who was with the Great Wild West shows years ago, the Great 101 show.
Was she really such a marksman with her gun as she is depicted to be?
Buffalo Bill?
No, Annie Oakley.
Yeah, she was the best.
She really was.
She was the best. She even had a lot of men beat. Yeah, she made her living. She was raised in a big family, and she made her living shooting quail with a rifle, because she'd hit them right in the head. She could send them to New York, and they didn't have all that buckshot in them. And of course, quail was expensive in those days in New York City. That's why she made a lot of her money to start out with.
Well, I did.
Yeah, and Annie Oakley was quite a character. She was quite a girl. Some of the great cowboys, and this one is still alive, Hank Darnell, it was with the 101 Wild West show and worked at the ranch. The Schultz boys at Ponca City, some of them still alive, some of them have gone. They worked at the 101 ranch. There was Don Donahue, Jack McCracken, who I know real well. He came by and saw me just a few years ago. Was a great cowboy and teamster for the 101 ranch. He drove 6 beige mules hooked up to that beautiful stagecoach of the 101 ranch, which is now down in the museum in Oklahoma City, just south of the Capitol building.
Oh,
they've got it cased in there and all painted up. It's a gorgeous thing. That's the famous 101 ranch. Ken Kincaid was a sharpshooter, and him and his wife both done shooting with the 101 ranch. He's still alive. Pecos Higgins, who now is passed away several years ago, was a great cowboy down there. I have a picture of him when he was about 70 years old. Frank C. Marshall, who comes to our reunions at Ponca City, was with the 101 show.
Oh, you have reunions of this?
Oh, yeah. We have reunions every year. We've had 3 of them now, and we'll have another one in August.
Of this year.
There was Royce Donovan, Rusty Turk, Hazel King. They were all 101 show people. Henry Wagner was with the 100 show. M.E. Pearson was with the 101 show, and most of these boys worked at the ranch. There's Harold Mapes. Well, that's about all I've got written down there. At the 101 ranch, it was a town by itself. It had even a church, grocery stores, restaurants. They had their own blacksmith shop. They done canning of all kinds. They had their own tannery. They made their own, had tanned their hides. They made their own saddles, their own bridles. They had everything on the ranch to live with. They didn't have to go off of it for anything. They raised all kinds of fruits and vegetables and apples. Of course, all kinds of stock and pigs. And of course, you got any notes there to what we're going to redo?
Yeah. You mentioned in our former conversation, you mentioned some of these very notable people. And suppose we go over a few of those again. Tell me as much as you can about that 101 show, the greatest show on earth.
Well, I didn't tell you too much about that. I don't. Well, I don't know too much in detail of it because I wasn't there. I was down at the ranch. But I don't know. They had trains and trainloads of all kind of cars and stuff that took the people and the animals and everything they had.
Where did they get all those animals?
Well,
collected them from?
They collected them from one place to another. You know, they had a lot of elephants down there, and this bird that discovered the North Pole, you know, was down there at the 101 Ranch.
That's right.
I don't know whether I told you that before or not. He was there.
Well, it was very successful for a while, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
And then you said it went broke.
Yeah.
That was too bad.
It went broke and lost everything.
Lost all he had.
Yeah. Zach Miller had a little show in Chicago in '33, and that was the last one. They went broke, and Zach died in 1952, and 1950, I was over there talking to him in Punk City.
You mentioned that the 101 Ranch boys have a get-together reunion.
Yeah, we
in
have
August,
one.
Every year.
Yeah, it's
That's interesting.
the latter part of August.
And you had about 60.
We had 60 there last year. Hope to have that many or more. We had one woman from Alaska come down from Alaska to it. Mm-hmm. And I have an Indian that comes every year from New York. We have them all over the United States that come to it.
That's interesting. I guess you wouldn't miss that.
No, I'd like to be there and hope to be there next August.
We mentioned the Indians a while ago, Geronimo, and we discussed him. What do you remember most about Geronimo? You said that they had their lands there, their reservation on the 101 Ranch land. And
well, not Geronimo didn't. He was Apache.
no, but the Indians.
The Pawnee Indians had their land right
That's
there,
right.
and they leased a lot of that Indian land, and of course they lived on each 160 acres that they had, the Pawnee Indians did. And of course the 101 leased the whole thing, and pastured it.
And Geronimo was the outstanding
Yeah,
character.
he came up there every time they had any kind of a show or anything. They always brought Geronimo up with his military guards. He was Apache. He died in 1909.
I believe you said you had a picture of him
I do.
with the guards.
Yeah.
The government, I understand history tells us that the government would have released him if he would have promised not to create another uprising.
Yeah.
But he would never promise.
Well, they was afraid of him because they turned him loose once or twice, and several times he got away, and they had to go get him again. So the last time they figured they'd keep him, they sent him and his family and part of the Indians down to Florida, and they didn't like the climate down there, and some of them died, so they sent him back to Fort Sill, and that's where he died, Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
And who is White Eagle?
White Eagle was chief of the Pawnee Indians, came down from Nebraska in 1877, as he said, with a rifle at his back, bring him to Oklahoma, and he wanted to go back, and Joe Miller talked him into staying here. He wanted to go back to Nebraska. They didn't all come down. Half of them did, and half of them didn't.
And Chief Bacon Ryan?
Well, he was younger. He's not one of the older ones, but he's very well liked by the Osage Indians. A lot of people liked him. He was quite a prominent chief of the Osage Nation.
But did he, were any of these with the 101 show?
No.
These were
No.
older Indians.
None of them.
Mhm. And you mentioned Buffalo Bill, Colonel Bill Cody.
Yeah.
When did you see him?
Well, I saw him the first time down there at the 101 Ranch when he came down there, and I believe I told you that story about riding with him. And I saw him several times after when the show came through Oklahoma, or he was around. I run into him every once in a while.
You were very pleased to make that ride with him.
Yeah, I thought that was very nice to have a chance to do that.
And he became celebrated after that too, even more so, didn't he?
Oh yeah, yes, a lot more so.
And Ida Red seemed to be one of your favorites.
Well, he was a cowboy that came out of New York City in about 1880 and went to work for the 101.
Nameless.
And,
Nameless.
Yeah, nameless.
He didn't give his own
All
name.
the name that they ever had, or all they ever called him, was a song he sang about his girlfriend, Ida Red. He never told his name. I don't think he wanted anybody to know it.
No. He was out here.
I think that's the reason he was so scared, when he got mixed up with Marshall there and shot him, that he beat it down to Texas coast and caught the first boat to Africa.
Oh.
He was afraid with some of the other things I think he had.
Well, that fight, the marshal wasn't quite above board with that, was he?
Well, Zach Miller didn't think so. He kind of watched him. They both agreed to lay their pistols and holsters up on the bar, and they did. And then when they went out the door, Zach was watching because he never did like him too well, and saw that he had this derringer he was taking out. He hollered his eye red and told him he had the derringer, and he threw his coat over to him. He turned around and shot the marshal. Thought he'd killed him, but he just hit him in the arm. But he beat it out of the country and went to Africa. They heard from him several years later.
And Bill Pickett?
Bill Pickett? Well, he was a colored boy that started bulldogging, and Colonel Joe Miller heard about it, and he sent Zach Miller down to get him. He was working on a ranch down in Texas.
And was he the one who wore the boots that your father had made?
Yeah. Dad made a pair of boots for Bill Pickett. He was quite famous with bulldogging because he's the boy that started, Bill Pickett did.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, a lot of them took it up afterwards, but he's...
Let's wait just a minute. Let's check this machine now.
You're okay. Go ahead.
Is it?
I get a sound right.
Well,
Volume
that
right.
red was on a while ago.
Yeah, volume okay.
Yes, I
Use
think
microphone.
so.
Okay, go ahead.
The boots that your father made, you spoke about, of course, all of a cowboy's boots were his pride, and the heels of them.
Yeah, 3 inches.
And why?
Well, they wore those because when they put their foot in the stirrup, they didn't want the shoe to go through and catch them because they were on a bad horse. And about the time they hit that stirrup, that horse might start bucking or something, and they wanted to be sure they had one foot in the stirrup. And, of course, that's the reason they wore those high heels, to catch them as they put their foot in the stirrup.
Good shape.
Okay, thank you. And this Bill Pickett became very famous then as a
Yeah,
representative.
he was one of the most famous show people they had on account of bulldogging. He did it in the show, and he made a good salary and enjoyed the show business. His wife used to cook for the Miller boys down there at the ranch at one time. But
Oh, he's quite a famous Oklahoman, he's considered quite a famous Oklahoman.
oh yeah, they got him the Cowboy Hall of Fame.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And he's considered an Oklahoman. He may have come from Texas.
Yeah.
And Pawnee Bill, the scout, you had him in your experience too.
Yeah, I met Pawnee Bill first down at the 101 Ranch, and then a few months or probably a year or something later when Charles Milam was buying up some horses for Zach Miller, we went over by Pawnee Bill's place because he heard of an Indian that had some ponies down there, and we knew that Pawnee Bill knew them all, and by name and where they lived, so we went down to his place, picked him up, and he rode over to the Indian's farm to pick up those ponies.
He had been a teacher at one time, hadn't he?
Huh?
He had been a teacher at one time, hadn't he?
A what?
A teacher?
Yeah, he taught. He taught in Indian school.
Uh-huh.
Because he was
That's how he
was
knew.
an interpreter, and he taught in the Indian school because he could teach them English language and he understood the Indian language.
And he bought these Indian ponies from the Indians.
We did, yeah. Charles Milam and I did that.
Did you?
Yeah.
And
he was selling them to Zach Miller,
Can you describe those little Indian ponies? They were the wild ponies that they
Well,
had caught, and
yeah, most of them were
they were
wild.
called tame.
Some of them hadn't been rode, and of course most of them were Indian ponies, we call them, or patches, colored whites and browns and blacks and everything else.
Paints and pintos.
Yeah, and they were pretty wild, most of them. Not too big a horse.
Then Charles Milam,
Well, he was my cowboy friend. He was about 10 years older than I was, and he was from Texas. He was 6'2", and we palled around quite a bit together, buying horses, and he'd go down to the ranch and work a while, and then he'd go out and buy some more horses, and he's just in and out. He's as bad as Will Rogers. He never stayed anywhere very long.
Will Rogers was the one that you said would drift in and drift out.
Yeah, we called him Saddle Tramp because he worked for 2 or 3 months, and then he'd go down to Texas and work, or he'd go down to Zach Mulhall's ranch and work for Zach, and then he'd come back and work for them again, and he didn't stay anyplace much.
You remember him as he was in his younger days.
Oh, yeah.
And before he made good with his...
First time I saw him, I was sitting on the corral fence there at the 101 Ranch, and he come up and says howdy, and he had some kind of a crack answer. He always had some wit or something or other, you know. And he's quite a fellow. Will was a nice boy.
And Tom Mix, his friend?
Well, Tom Nix worked down there at the 101 when I did. Tom was quite a wild fella. He had been marshal of several places in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, and he was pretty rough. He'd fight you with his fist or with a gun. He didn't care what it was. And he was pretty mean in some ways, Tom Nix was. He made a wonderful showman, though, because he was good looking. Big, you know.
I remember.
Yeah.
I suppose that he got his start in show business through Will Rogers, did he not?
Well, I think some, yeah, but he was with the 101, and I think later on he got tired of that and finally drifted into made his own show.
Uh-huh. And
he had a nice show. Old Major Guthrie, that I talked to just a few years ago, worked with him for years, was married to his daughter at one time, and him and I got pretty well acquainted with each other on account of talking about Tom Nix, you know, and one thing and another. He worked with him in the show business. Tom had a pretty good show for a long time, but like all the rest of them, they all went broke.
Annie Oakley, too, was 101.
Yeah, she was a sharpshooter with the 101.
Was she really as good a shot as they say?
Oh yeah, she was a crack shot. Anybody that wanted to challenge her, she would, because there are very few. I don't think anybody ever beat her. She was just quick, you know. When she started shooting, and shooting quail with a rifle, and hitting those quail in the head, made a good market for New York because they didn't have all that buckshot to take out of them. People shooting buckshot, you know, they had to take all that buckshot out. The quail ain't a very big bird.
Yeah.
But she'd hit them right in the head, you know, and kill them and ship them to New York. And
so she had a good business in that then.
Oh, yeah. That's where when she was a young girl home in the big family, that's what kept the family going, was Annie Oakley killing quail for the eastern markets.
Yeah. And you mentioned Mr. Hinkle,
Yeah.
Milt Hinkle.
Milt Hinkle.
Who's still writing some, I believe.
He's still alive. He lived down in Kissimmee, Florida, and he writes quite a bit for the Western magazines. There was a short story of him about something he wrote in the Frontier magazine I got just a few days ago. Wasn't a long story, but he's written a lot of them.
And that was probably based on his experiences.
Yeah, a lot of what he knew, yeah.
Some of them you probably remember.
Yeah. He was one of the last trail guys from Texas to Wichita and Abilene and Kansas City. Went up to Kansas City stockyards one time with a bunch of cattle. But he was from down in Texas.
And I believe you knew Pistol Pete.
Pistol Pete, I knew him real well. I got acquainted with him later in life, not too many years back, at a gun show.
Uh-huh.
I had heard a lot about him, but I'd never met him.
But you did meet him.
But I did meet him. Oh yes, I saw him lots of times. I have some nice pictures of him. I have a nice picture of Milt Hinkle and, well, all these boys. But,
and Mr. Marshall, I mean, he was a marshal. Pistol Pete was at one time a marshal.
oh yeah, he was a marshal and worked under the hanging judge of Fort Smith. Here
That's
in
right,
Oklahoma.
Parker.
Yeah, Judge Parker.
That was quick work, I guess, between the two of them, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Everybody that
yeah.
got up against both of them. The Schultz boys you mentioned.
Yeah, they're still over at Ponca
and
City.
some of them.
The younger one just told me last year when I was over there at the reunion that my dad made him first boots for him. Some of those Schultz boys have passed away.
Yes.
But they had a farm down there south of Ponca City between there and Bliss, Oklahoma, and still do. And I think they run the Western store in Ponca City. I believe that belongs to Schultz.
You told us something a little bit ago about the 101 stagecoach ranch on the ranch.
Yeah, well, it's down in Oklahoma City at the museum there, just south of the Capitol building, down in the basement. It's all cased in glass. It's all been painted up new, so it looks pretty.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one we rode in and used at the 101 range.
And they drove mules.
Yeah.
To it.
Jack McCracken drove a span of six mules, 3 span of mules that were a beautiful beige color, just pure beige, all except the black stripe that they started at his head and went down his neck and his back and clear back to his tail. Just that one black stripe. All of them were, you couldn't tell one of the other part from the other. Beautiful. They were beautiful.
And who was this driver?
Jack McCracken.
McCracken.
Yeah, he's still alive. He lives down, he's my age. He lives down in Texas. He married a woman down there that had a ranch about a year or so ago.
Well, does he come back for your reunion?
No, he didn't get there last year.
Maybe he will this time.
Yeah, we hope so. He come by the house several years ago, was just going to drop and see us and say hello. He spent 4 hours. We hadn't had anything to eat. We was getting hungry. He got up and ate a great big breakfast, you know. Yeah, he's a nice fellow. He writes to me every once in a while, and I write to him. Voyage with the...
Who was this Hank Darnell?
Well, he was a voyage with the 101 show. Hank was pretty good with the rifle and very good with ropes. He was quite an artist with the twirling ropes, you know.
Well, and you mentioned the Hank Darnell was he on the ranch with you at the time?
Yeah, he was there at the time, but a lot of the time he's with the show because the show was out on the road.
At that time?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
About
what year did that show start? You remember?
Well, a lot of discussion about the 1907, as far as I have been able to find out with all these big old cowboys, old time ones that I wrote to.
Let's see, I believe we were talking about the boys, the Schultz boys that you said came back to the reunion.
Yeah.
And
one of them told me about the dad made his first pair of boots.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the spurs, did we get that? How different the spurs were now and then?
Oh yeah, they were sharp then. They had about 8 or 10 times more spikes on them than they got now. They're dull and big and thick, you know, just something to kind of touch the horse with. They were spikes. If you hit the horse too hard, you could make him bleed, but most of them just touched him, you know. But they had them in case of emergency. One of those wild horses got to cutting up, they'd slow him down.
Usually the cowboys were very fond of their horses, the ones that...
Oh, yeah. That was their best friend, you know.
That's right.
Yeah. That was their best friend.
And then I wanted to ask you about. Oh, the Miller brothers. Are they still living?
No,
They're not.
no. Zach Miller was the last one to pass away in '52.
Mm-hmm. But you hear from one of his daughters occasionally.
No, that's Joe Miller.
Joe Miller.
Joe Miller lives
Uh-huh.
over in Arkansas.
I
And Joe
see.
Miller's two sons lives in Ponca City. One's an attorney and the other's in a loan business.
Mhm.
See
And-
them at the reunion every year.
Yeah. Well, we certainly do enjoy having you for this interview. This has been a good one. We
Well,
appreciate it so much.
I know a
is
lot,
any-
but it's hard to remember all of it.
I know it is. Is there anything else that you think of? That's all that I have my notes on.
I sure can't. We said so much.
Yes.
I think you've got most of it.
I think I have all that
Yeah.
all that we missed on it, and I believe that we have the. I think that we have the ones that we had in
There's
just
only
about the order.
one thing, they were great days and they're gone forever.
Well, the good old days.
Yeah, good old days. Right.
Well, that's the way we talk about them anyway.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder when all of the convenience.
There is no sign-off on this interview. It simply ends in mid-sentence. We have copied it exactly as it appears on the Living Legend reel-to-reel master tape.